So I'm going to start the conversation with Sarah Byrden because she actually invited me into this conversation. And so I wanted to start off. And I want to read a short line from our description that Sarah wrote. We come together to cut through, to inhabit ourselves more truly, moving out of the false feminine feeling of not knowing into the deep, visceral knowing of a fierce kind of love. So my first question or conversation is, you invited me to work with it because of myth and your sexuality work. Both of those brought up the fierce feminine. And so, Sarah, tell us what you discovered.
Yeah, so this feels like a thread I've been tracking for, I'd say, a decade in the work that I've been doing, and it feels really exciting to be sort of giving it some space to talk about and work with really directly. I started noticing, and I still notice, I mean, all the way until today, it's consistent enough to feel like a really important pattern to be kind of inquiring into in both my sexuality work, in teaching sexuality work, and in working with myth and story. That what I noticed is in working with women, especially with female-bodied people, is that it was the inhabitants of a kind of fierceness that was necessary for them, for us to step into our power, or to reach what it was that was our intention, or to free ourselves from some kind of domestication, some kind of capture. And that over and over, those gestures of fierceness were so foreign to us, that they were so foreign in what it was that we felt like we were allowed to do, say, inhabit, gesture, like the energies we were allowed to bring forward in our expression. And they were every time they were the thing that was absolutely necessary to call upon and to conjure up in order for the kind of sovereignty and inhabitants and power that it was that we were there seeking to recover. And in this, I want to start with sexuality. I want to start with myth, actually. So in so many myths, and I work really and have for a long time, I work very specifically a lot with the stories and myths in Women Who Run with the Wolves. And then there's other stories and myths that I think I find and collect and work with. And in most of the endings of those stories that are working with how, like, mapping and tracking into, how did I get here? How did I find myself into a sort of context in which I am no longer a free agent of my power and no longer in the kind of expression and freedom and power that I want to be? In the myth of Bluebeard, that is such a powerful, I think, universal myth around what it is that we marry because we were promised something really shiny and fantastic, and in that, what we have actually married into is a promise of our demise. And inside of that myth, what is necessary for her to finally, one, open the door that she's not supposed to open and start seeing and asking the questions that she has been threatened by death to not open and not ask. And then finally to actually, it is a very bloody ending in Bluebeard. He is on his way to seize her and to kill her. And it is a bloody kind of quick sort of severing that cuts him into pieces and puts him to final rest. And in working with that myth, it is what we're all tracking into is, what is it that we actually need to kill, need to sever from, need to create separation and differentiation from, in order to say, no more. I will not live like this. I will not agree to your rules. I will not buy into into the fantasy. I will not buy into what's the word I want to use there? The bargain, the bad bargain. And in working with it, I always am working with myth and story through a somatic lens also. And it's these gestures of cutting through and of severing that when we would find them and we would touch them, it is always this kind of experience inside of women of so much relief and so much I'm back in my own bones and my own skin. And this is the kind of knowing that I have. And it is these gestures that I have found are so foreign and somehow worked up in our mind or our understanding that we're not supposed to enact them. They're in some way sort of illegal in a cultural socialized context, that they aren't what we are to embody and act as women, that they're not how we are supposed to be. And we find that in stories at the end where the freedom is dependent on tying up the capture, what would that word be? The entity that is capturing us, containing, separating from, leaving, walking away from. And in my sexuality work, there has been this very powerful and I think important and fascinating dynamic that I have witnessed that is, especially when women have experienced some kind of sexual violence, have a history of some kind of sexual trauma, where they have experienced a violence, a manipulation and use of power as violence, that has been what has created tremendous amount of pain and harm. That to then allow that kind of power to rise up inside of their own systems and to let flood through something that is at heart not the same thing, is not violent, is not manipulative, is not damaging, but in some way echoes the kinds of gestures that were enacted upon them as violence, that becomes almost impossible for women to actually inhabit as motions and gestures toward their own inhabitants and freedom. And so there is this necessity to kind of work with the body and the soma to begin to tease apart and to inhabit a kind of fierceness that we can discern from violence, that we can discern from violences enacted upon us, our own bodies, and know that there is a fierceness that actually contains tremendous wisdom and love and generosity and compassion in those very same actions. They're enacting is freedom, is love, is all of these things that are innate to us in our wild selves, in our instinctual selves, and in our whole selves. So this has been, these are always these parts of both the sexuality work and the mythology work. And I wanted to give them sort of their own forum for conversation and also to work with in terms of soma and gesture, and say, what is happening here, and what is this fierceness what is our relationship to this fierceness? So that has been my impetus and really kind of excitement around the necessity of this topic and conversation. And you, Liz, have been very specifically someone I have wanted to be in conversation and collaborate with in working with this, because of the uniqueness of your work. And I think the power of your particular lens is, it's actually profound. I mean, I use that word really, really intentionally. So that's a little bit how this came to be and why I wanted to invite you into this. And I'm curious, what even just what I have said, or if as you consider the fierce feminine through the lens of core awareness, of core integrity, of the psoas as a muscle that is a messenger of the soul, of what it is to actually rewild as the animal body, what that sparks for you in your perspective and lens.
Well, thank you. I guess one of the things that I want to track just for a moment before I head in there is something that Clarissa Pincola Estes, Dr. Estes, where we both met. You were already studying with her. I've taken a couple rounds. One of them was singing down in the bones. So, down the bones or into the bones, or can't remember quite the name of it. But it is about like living from the bones, like literally. And so many of her stories in Women Who Run with the Wolves speaks to what we're talking about. So it's a good resource for anybody who's kind of just entering this conversation. But one of the things that I happened to pull up today was something she said, because Baba Yaga is up for me right now. Baba Yaga is up for me a lot. I just really want to know when Baba Yaga became Baba Yaga, and when do you know you've because I feel like I'm somewhere right around there. So she said, some dismiss the fairy tale world as a world unreal. So myth and fairy tale being unreal, when in fact it carries literally thousands of instructions about how to live, how to dodge and duck, what to run toward and what to escape from, what to embrace as critical to the life of the soul. So when we play with this relationship between primal movement and the myths and stories that we hear as children, or we've read as fairy tales, or we watch, or whatever, however they come through the cultural field, they speak to something that is, they speak to the social construct, but they're also speaking to something that isn't a social construct, which is why you're saying, there's so much fear around the power of, we immediately go to violence when we think of something wild. If you look up the word wild, it is a negative word in the social construct. So when I wrote Stalking Wild, I looked it up and it's like, oh my God, everything about it is negative. It's undomesticated, it's, outrageous, it's out of bounds, it's, it's all about something that you're not in control of. And it is to be controlled, it is to be captured. But there's another piece. There's this always about whether we're captured or not, which is true. That's a big piece. But there's also the ability to capture, the ability to bite through, the ability to devour. And certainly in the sexual energy of one's being, that devouring happens on so many levels. I mean, literally, we eat and we chew and we digest, and we try to do it really well so we don't look too wild about doing it, but we don't tear it apart. But years ago, one of the ways I undomesticated myself was to pick up a piece of meat and eat it with my hands. Okay, if I'm going to eat an animal, I'm going to eat an animal, and I'm going to know I'm eating an animal. I'm not going to pretend it's something other than. So we see, even in our very everyday movements, these ways that we control the animal body, that we don't want to be a mammal. We don't want to be part of the living wild. We've been trained, we've been literally groomed to not behave that way. So then we're looking at what does that mean to us and to the soul. I think it's very critical. I agree with Dr. Estes. This is really critical. And so my work on the primal, what is called, I call them primal expression in embryology, they're literal gestures of the embryo, that living, how a living organism emerges. And psoas is a messenger of this not cortexual social construct. Psoas is in the back body. It's in the reptilian brain. It's in the field of animal body. It really could care less what the social construct is or conditionings. It's really speaking to something much more what I call coherent in the field of the living, of living systems, of living capacity as an organism. And it really brings us into our bones. It's talking about bones. Can we feel that we've arrived here on Earth? Can we feel what it is to be an animal, to be even if we don't define ourselves as animal, as a living being that has more, has literally more bacteria than it has human cells. Like, we don't even know what we are. We don't even know what we're capable of. So we're really exploring something that is taboo. It's a deeply taboo to be animal, to be living in a system that isn't an object, that isn't controlled, that isn't contained, that isn't shaped, isn't formed. And I think this way. I mean, the minute I say that, I think, oh my God, it's just going to go wild. I mean, it's just, everything's going to, like, we won't have any control over, the way we behave. We'll just start, becoming cannibals. And I mean, I can feel the conditioning. I can hear it in myself. I mean, there must be generations of ancestors like, oh God, don't go there. You'll be burned at the stake. You'll be, whatever it is, whatever the fear is of touching life in an intimacy that is so deeply, profoundly nourishing. And in that is that, to me, the fierceness of being alive. It is the desire, the longing, the gesture of what is in embryology called, Jaap van der Wal, as an embryologist says, is the impulse of the human organism to rise up against falling apart. That's called longing. That's a longing to show up here in all the stratas of my biological tissue and the magic of all of that. So when we take it even out of the social mythology, we see that the mythology somewhere along there is talking the biological conversation. They're using words of story as humans like, because we like story. But in there, the energy, and that's what I love about the elemental piece that you do, the movements and gestures do exactly what life does. It cuts through something. I always use the beautiful rose bush blossoming and flourishing, and how, you have to cut it down for it to keep doing that. It actually extends itself to a point where it's out at its fingertips. But each time we cut out what is dead, that capacity to flourish shows back up again. It enhances it. So I love the fact that we're going to play with both the primal gesture of how do we dissolve, how do we let go, how do we die, but to also how do we show up and how do we become not only that which is captured, but that which captures. Can we actually face that part of ourselves or feel into the depth of that? And what would that mean? What would that look like? Because I think we have so many ideas what that might look like that we're terrified to go there. It's kind of like what you're speaking to, the harm that has been done. And some of the harm is innocuous. It's almost invisible. It's a way that we don't have to be caught. We're already behaving as if we are caught.
Before the capture, before the new capture happens, we're walking around as if we have already innately been captured, and we can only move within certain bounds or textures or tones or
Yeah. So one of my questions to you that I really want to ask, because we talked about this with the workshop coming up, in different ways, and we'll develop ideas, but today I really want to talk about, so let's go deeper. What is the fierce feminine? And I know you've talked about true yin, true yang. I want you to talk about what is, not what isn't, because that's kind of where we go when we go there. We start talking about how we're not that, right? And today I really want to go to what do you understand in the flesh and blood of your being as the fierce feminine?
Well, I want to answer that question in just speaking to something you just named, which is that there is this found coherence inside of wildness, and it's even hard to use that word because it's been, I don't know, there's all kinds of, it's been diluted or twisted in all a lot of different directions. But that what I hear you speaking about is that inside of this biological organism there is a vast integrity. There is an integrity that knows, and this goes into in my work where I'm working a lot through archetypal qigong and through the somatic inhabitants of archetypal gestures, that inside of a single gesture is a single story, both mythological and biological. It is a somatic impulse. It is it's a sensation that gives us the cue of what it is that is actually true and rising up for us, that we can turn away from or not. And I think but before I go further into that question, I think I just want to speak a little bit to something you just spoke to, is because we have so many examples of such distorted expressions of power over, of power to use one for one's own benefit, for all of that. I think there is something that we are afraid of, that is, if I say no and have a gesture that says no, that through a gesture that is both somatic but also is in real terms in my life, how do I mark and claim my territory? That is something animals naturally do all the time. They are marking territory. They are paying attention to territory. They will bite when you cross a territory, when some particular creature is not welcome in there, that they will mark territory. And so I think if we are not leaning into the integrity of the impulses that rise up and actually carrying through in what it is that we feel like we want to say, which maybe is no, I'm done, not here, over there, cutting back, that we can sort of fear ourselves into the furthest expression of whatever that is, which is, if I start eating that steak with my hands, I'm going to eat everything around here. I'm going to pick up my dog and start eating my dog. I mean, that's a ridiculous example, but just to that we have this thing of, if I do that, then that is going to burn unchecked into beyond and beyond. And so in the work that I do, my somatic work is around archetypal qigong, which is working with gestures and through a somatic understanding and exploration of what true yin and true yang energy are, which were profound teachings and transmissions I got when I was studying archetypal qigong, when I started that work over 10 years ago. And that inherent in the relationship between true yin and true yang is this relationship of integrity and coherence, that to actually, first of all, that there is, inside of true yin is a tremendous, I would even almost use the word formidable. We could imagine it as a formidable power that contains the power to both give birth and to give death as a action of life giving in in our bodies, in our creative acts, that the yin field is this powerful magnetic mountain of energy that is pulsing with a sort of deep knowing. And it is the yin field is what exists underneath and behind. It is what cannot be seen but can be felt. It's when we experience a gesture that has power to it, it's because it has a yin field behind it, and what it's carrying through is the intelligence of an unseen place. When we have gestures that come forward that do not come from the yin field, we can sort of feel that they are empty, that there is a way to enact a gesture and actually have it be energetically or sort of somatically, as if just going through the motion, an autopilot, and that the yin field is the root of all yang action. So the gesture of severing is actually a yang gesture, yang energy that is inherently more directed. It's more precise. It moves up and out and forward. Whereas what yin energy does is it gathers and collects and begins to create a whole field until a natural movement comes from that. And in the integrity of the gestures, as we explore them in the archetypal Qigong, is that in order for, let's say, a gesture of severance to be true, it has to, and I mean, I can't totally, I'm not going to teach a Qigong class here, but it has to come from the yin field, motion cut through with a yang precise gesture, and then let it go and return back into the yin field. That there is always a willingness to come from and return to the yin field, which keeps the integrity of a yang gesture, whether that is differentiation, severing, protection, boundary creating, that it doesn't have to become a blade and stay a blade forever.
Mm-hmm.
Right here.
And you're talking about something really important, because that is the fear of the something keep going, right?
Totally.
Once I lose control, I'll cut down everybody, and I'll say no to everything. I'll destroy everything. I'll burn the whole thing down.
Yeah.
Right? And that is where sensing that energy. And when you speak of the yin, I feel the yin feel that is where psoas is. That it's the juiciest fluid, elusive tissue in your being. Probably it's as massive as it is. It's a field of energy, and it's reading something that, as you said, you know it. You just know. And what this does is it bypasses the brain. And we have been trained the only way we think or be, or why we are apart, separate from everything else, is because we have a brain. But actually, that's not true. The knowing is what I call direct perception. It's the capacity to feel into that field, to know it, not know it like I've got it, I've got it, but know that I'm being moved by something that is very authentic and in this moment, the absolute right gesture for the moment, right? There is no indecision in that moment. There is no doubt. There is no, the mama bear does what she does to protect. So protection is part of this capacity to sever, to stand ground, to stand in the bones of our being. So I think you've touched on something that, whether it's conscious or unconscious, we are really trained to try to take this understanding and put it in the frontal cortex and understand it. And story and myth kind of does that. It's interesting. It's an interplay between this direct knowing and what we call our instinctual self.
I would say story and myth actually doesn't put it there. I think it can. If you're reading story and myth as something I say about Women Who Run with the Wolves is it's not a book. If you read it like a book, you're missing the whole thing.
Yeah.
So there is a way to approach story and myth that keeps it in the frontal cortex, but I actually think that's not what it really is. I
No,
think
I'm
what it
saying I'm
actually
agreeing with you.
does.
I'm agreeing
Okay.
with you. I'm saying that
Yeah.
though it's like a story that we can shape in words, it's carrying the field.
So
Yes,
yes,
it's carrying
transmitting something
right.
that is
We're
beyond
saying the same
time.
thing. Yeah.
Totally. And so, oh, I just totally went blank. You said something I was going to go with on. I mean, I think when we move with it in the body, when we go into gesture, but be that archetypal gestures or biointelligent embryological gestures, there is a way that in body we understand that a cycle completes itself and becomes something else.
Mhm.
If we're just in our minds about it, it is very easy to think exactly what you said. I will lose control. I will burn the house down. I whatever. But if we actually do the gesture and we complete it, it turns into something else,
It
which
does.
is in this, which is why I love the interplay of our work, because it's two sort of different ends of exploring the same thing. If we sever and we come here, and I can't do it while I'm sitting in a chair, really, but we come here, but we make that gesture true and all of ourselves behind it, not like I want to make 1,000 micro cuts to say no. I'm going to say maybe no. Like there's a way to make 1,000 paper cuts that is exhausting and is part of false feminine and is part of false yang. Or there is a way to make one gesture, to say one no, that has enough of body and energy and truth behind it that we don't have to keep saying no and no and no and no. We attend to the moment and we complete the gesture, and the gesture inevitably, as every living thing, as every living cycle, becomes something else. And there is no way to totally, I think, trust cycles and trust the intelligence of completing gestures except through body, except through actual gesture.
Well, we have to remember our brain is also tissue. And part of the disassociation is talking about body and mind as if they're two different things. And so what we're looking at as a culture is a lack of this, what I call direct perception, or the sensory system being actually primary. So what I have fostered in this being I call Liz, it is the capacity to keep tracking sensation, not through my mind. I'm not doing it like I'm thinking about it. That's not where I'm at, where my attention is. Direct perception is what we also think of as knowing something, what we think of as intuitive knowing or instinctual knowing. It's that feeling like you walk in somewhere and you can't quite read the situation, but you absolutely know you belong there and you want to be there, or you absolutely know you do not want to be. It's not that every decision is made that way, but there is a gut knowing, there is an intuitive knowing, there is a bone knowing. And as we actually allow ourselves to be moved by the organism, not move it, not do these gestures with your mind.
Right.
Once you can dissolve the insistence that the mind is going to control the body's movement pattern, once you can let go of the cortex as your primary perception, because that's what I'm interested in, is perception. There is perception in tissue. There is knowing in tissue. There is a knowing in the bones that I don't care how much I think about it. It's different. It's a different experience of life. and that's what my work is about, partly because that's what psoas is always talking about. So if you want a healthy psoas, you have to actually listen to what its message is, which is most of the time you don't know where your bones are. You like your what's called proprioception, the direct sensory system, is a relationship with the Earth's gravitational field. You are not floating in space. You are here on Earth. We are here. We have shown up here as an organism, and whatever you want to call that organism, whatever you want to call, we're a living organism. We're a living system of some kind. And when we can show up fully in that system, like you said, has an intelligence. That intelligence is not local; it's global. So all of a sudden, your bones, in particular, begin to organize you in time and space, which means you actually show up in this moment, not last year or in the future. You actually inhabit, you could say, this moment. What Zen people say, the now. It's like that's what it happens. And so the reason why I love the combination of our work together is that usually somebody does Qigong coming off the street. They've worked in their office, they've done their whatever, and they come to class, right? In a traditional class, they show up, right? And they show up as the social being, and then they try to let that go and move into these beautiful forms or gestures. But your work is already very, there's something the way you're communicating it that takes it again out of the idea of doing something into the actuality of the sensory system. So that's your work, the way you've experienced yourself in fluid and water, and so when we dissolve the insistence that's in our organism to show up in a certain way, which is what we do a lot, is we dissolve the insistence. All of a sudden, those energies, the fierceness, the feminine yin, but the fierceness of a woman, it's like her organism starts to really show up. And the reason why I speak to women in particular that I think is very important, as I said to you before, is not just the cycles, but we are how every other human being arrives on this face of the earth, is through a woman's body. It is the first relationship to earth, to the cycles, to the rhythms, to the beingness of showing up here, rooting into our mother's womb. That is the earth. That is that, I think we had a little pause there. That is the earth. And so I don't want to go into the social construct of what is yin and yang in the sense of how our social world wants to look at duality, but as a force of energy, as the way we know, that's why I call it, she who bleeds but does not die. There is a fierceness in the female that is not present in our culture in any way that really gives it's kind of what you're talking about. It doesn't have all that support behind it. It doesn't have all that nourishment. So as we kind of have to kind of bring this, I want you to speak to that, because when you're watching a woman show her power, it feels to me it's a lot about the yang gestures. Like, I don't know who's coming up right now is Beyonce. Like the gestures she makes to me are very male. They're not actually very yin in there. I don't want to get into her, but you know what I'm saying? Like a lot of what we see in the feminine, you talk about the fiending part, but I want you to go not to what they're doing, but again, anything else you want to say about the fierce feminine from that relationship between the yin and yang, that it isn't a duality, it's a dynamic, right? It's a interplay between there. And like you said, it completes itself because it's a cycle. So anything else you want to speak to that cycle? Because I think it's big. You know, we work with dissolving, we work with showing up, right?
Well, I think, yeah, it's like, even I no longer can, my brain gets stopped when we even start using the words masculine and feminine. And I know that what we have in our title is the fierce feminine. But even, it's like yin and yang energy are not two things. It is not a duality. And it is a relationship that is a continuum of energy that is always moving and becoming its opposite, always. It is always becoming the other. It is like at the height of yang, the only place for it to go is to dissolve back into yin. And if yin gathers itself enough, if winter gathers itself enough and goes into the depth of that gestation and that incubation, the only place for it to go is to become spring. At the height of the expression of all of the most outward expression that we get, if we are in true relationship with cycles, we have brought all of the sugars in our core, in our trunk, out to show the world in this bountiful, beautiful, gorgeous, yang expression. In the work that I was taught in a way that makes total sense to me, is that every expression of beauty is a yang expression, because it is yang energy that carries it out to be seen. Then we have completely broken down the social construct of masculine and feminine, and I get really excited about that conversation. But the only place for all these leaves right now in the northern hemisphere, all of their energy has gone out and out and out. The only place for them to go now is for all of that sugar to come back into the core, and for those leaves to change color and to return to the earth. And so in our tending of cycles, in our inhabitants and expression of cycles, which is what takes care of our souls, is the willingness in order to travel cycles, take care of them, tend them, and let all of the ones that are trying to happen actually happen. It is, oh gosh, what was my point? The beginning of that sentence. It is, they're not two things. No. And so this conversation of the expression. So I don't know how to comment on Beyonce.
You don't have to. You actually did. You could go on from there. You did, because that's where she took it, right? You could say that's it. Yeah. We don't have to get distracted with that. I just wanted you to finish the cycle piece that you had. Okay. You had brought in because I want to give some time for questions. Totally. So let's move on to our playfulness, and just at least speak to you're doing cycle work, which we're doing one on Saturday that's on the preparing for fall. So those are cycles, right? And the Fierce Feminine is a live workshop in Boulder, Colorado, that we will talk about, because part of what we're not talking about for a lot of people is in the expression of a body right now. A lot of popularity is around the nervous system. How do we control our nervous system? How do we structure it so we behave well, so we're not either collapsed or we're in reaction? How do we, and we will, I will talk about that, because it is part of what psoas is always speaking to, you could say, or reflecting, but I think of it as a messenger of the midline, a messenger of the core integrity of your being, is really about the nervous system in terms of how resilient. So how do we move in and out of these cycles, right? And where do we get interrupted in them? And where is the wave missing? Where all of a sudden we're just, there is no space for any kind of flow. And in that is also the proprioception of the skeletal system. So like bones vibrate at the frequency of the earth. So the easiest way to actually land here is to sense your bones. So we'll break some of those down. I didn't want to do it here because time is, it goes fast. And I wanted to speak to this fierceness because I think it's such a it's in the air right now. We're you know, it's being called, I feel, in the organism, in life itself, in Mother Earth, you know, is this energy of allowing something to not be flattened and not be stable, but for the organism to start to be able to go through those fluctuations, you know,
and not to be held back. I think if it's like, if I'm looking at the women I work with and what is being held back, that is so important to the coherence that actually their entire organism is reaching for. It is around this conversation of fierceness. And one of the things I love that you bring in, that we don't obviously have time to go all the way into it, Liz, is be impulsive. Trust your impulses. That we have a culture that's like, don't be impulsive. But if we're talking about the intelligence of an animal body, the impulses are what makes the wave. The impulses are what actually creates the resilience. And can we come into enough of a sensory tracking to start to understand and listen to the impulses that are rising up in the tissue?
I agree. I really, the word impulsive is a negative term in the social construct, but impulses are absolutely messengers of clear information. And so that's a turning towards and I think a sensory experience of knowing in the bones that allows I mean, that's what play is. Play is innovation. It is the non-structure of the second, a moment, a time, a space where something new can appear. That is creativity. And I agree. It's kept very under wraps. Yeah. So we want to put out, if you have questions or something you'd like us to, there's a conversation going on.
Obviously, an hour is a short time.
Yeah, it is, but it's, you know, it's a lot in front of a Zoom to sit and ponder, but there's always more to discuss. It's a juicy conversation. Yeah. Yes, the myths of Kali. Yeah. Yeah. You know, I was thinking about, you know, the incredible Carla's talking about, it's scary to pick up that blade, you know, and how we're kind of confused in that moment. I feel like there's a confusion. Do you want to speak to that? Because I know that that you're very clear right now, Sarah. You've been really, this is really up for you right now in your life, in the way you're, you know, showing up in the world, and even the phase of life you're in. Okay. And so that picking up that blade, you want to speak to that? I think that's a really, you know, that idea of like Kali being able to have the need to say no more, to sever. You know, it goes back to the severing, whether it's your hand in a gesture or the blade of the, you know, pruning knife that creates the beautiful garden. You know.
Sure. I mean, I don't know. My first response to that question is that we don't pick up the blade. It's not something we pick up. And if we experience it as something we reach for that's outside of ourselves that we pick up, I think that's where there's a feeling of it's scary to pick up the blade. I am the blade. In that moment, you are the blade. And I'm not just saying this as a like semantic for fun. It actually feels like it's part of the difference between becoming the blade in the moment and wielding a blade for a specific purpose of what that blade was made for.
Yeah.
That is not something I have to go find, I have to go look for, and I have to take from outside of myself. And I think when it comes from here, like this tissue, and we don't, it's part of like the language of body. My body is not an object, nor is the blade I pick up. I am the blade that I wield.
Yeah.
I am the protection. I am the mountain. I am, and I mean that in a very somatic way, not just like to say something.
It's not a metaphor. No,
Yeah.
it's a reality. Love that.
Anyway, I guess that's
good.
my response to that.
Yeah, that's gave me chills. You know, chills are one of those big pieces.
Yeah, there's some.
Well, I'm glad people are excited, and it stirs the pot, so to speak. And you know, in being an older woman and feeling my energy changing, or even who I am in life changing, like how I show up, or how people receive me. You know, the Baba Yaga keeps coming up, and one of her is as a myth, or a fairy tale, or however you want to call it, is the mythos of it is that she is both actually, you know, this ability to consume, this ability to eat the children, you know, like that energy of ours, of where an energy could go. And yet she's also incredibly benevolent, and will grant you the wishes that you need. And the fact that is inhabiting in me, you know, like that is both of what I am, of who I am, is I feel into her more as I'm aging. I feel into, not as this monster, but that the monster is being called to show up in its fullness. And we're terrified of the monster, and yet she just doesn't take any bullshit around. Like, if you know, if you want something from her, you gotta show up in some way. She's not gonna spoon feed you. She's gonna ask you to show up in who you are. You know, like, do it now. You know, don't give me any stories about it. That's why you have to, you know, go through all those things. I'm starting to get that. So I don't know if there's a particular myth you're working with right now, or anything else you want to say in our last minute, but I'd like to hand it over to you.
Well, just on that, I just finished doing working with the story of the crescent moon bear, which is a story about feminine rage in women who run with the wolves. It's a beautiful, gorgeous story, but the same thing around the archetype of the bear in that story, and sort of this confrontation with the compassion itself and the wild instinctual nature, which is not tame, which at the same time stands on its hind legs and roars and is fierce in sort of in the same way of the Baba Yaga, and in the same gesture is so generous. But there is a, what are you here for? Ask for what you want. I will give you that. And we're not like, I don't want all the namby-pamby, like spoon, whatever we're doing. And so to experience that in ourselves, this fierceness is not a duality. It's not a singular thing that cancels out our gentleness, our lovingness, our compassion, our generosity, our giving. It is not another thing. It's actually the same energy that it is part of a whole self. And I see here this question that we do workshops every cycle, every seasonal cycle. There's one on Saturday, and then we are doing this Boulder in-person workshop that I am so excited to work with for 2.5 days in person. And in terms of an online workshop, you might be talking about the fierce feminine. At this point, we don't have plans for that. We're doing the Boulder workshop, is the place to come and do that, but that's first on our list. Curious if the workshop will be focused on cultivating direct perception and core awareness. Absolutely. Intrigued by the idea of what pain and illness is telling us. We can't totally go into the session what the sessions will look like, Deb, with the time we have right now. But what I can say for sure is we will be working in the tissue with body, with gesture, in very direct ways of perception, as well as the conversations that surround.
Yes, you can still sign up for classes, for the Saturday class. It's
not working on the website. Okay.
Go to the elemental self. That's
it's
where
just
you find
still
it.
might not
It's
actually be working.
Yeah.
So let me take a look at that, Madeline.
Yeah.
Yes, it's open till Saturday morning. You can sign up till 9 a.m. Mountain Time.
All right. Thank you, everybody, for holding space for us to chat and connect around what I think is truly auspicious conversation.
Yeah, thanks for being here. I mean, you're helping make this conversation.
Well, we can feel your energy holding us. So you create a circle or container, and also listening ears that we'd love to hear from you. So feel free to reach out to either of us or both of us.
All right. And if you have specific questions about the workshops or whatever, definitely write about those. And
yeah, there's something about being in the room together. We've worked together, and the energy that builds also through the repeating of going through, the capacity and the holding of all of our energy. It's a cauldron of capacity that's has a lot of potential. All righty.
Thank you, Liz. Thank you, all of you.
Yeah.